With Reform UK continuing to perform well in the polls, there's now a non-trivial chance that Nigel Farage could be the UK's next Prime Minister. And with Reform making ambitious promises such as scrapping all income tax for earnings under £20,000, you can see why some people might be considering voting for them at the next election. But can we really trust Farage and Reform to run the economy sensibly? Or will they just end up bankrupting the country? This video will discuss this question by laying out what Reform have promised to do if they were elected, and how they're going to pay for it. And we'll see how the numbers stack up. But before we get started, I just want to say that this isn't meant to be a heavily political video. It's more meant to be about fiscal policy. So I'm going to try and stay as politically neutral as possible and just stick to the numbers without commenting too much on the policies themselves. So to begin with, I think it's worth reminding ourselves about the basics of fiscal policy, i.e. how much government spend and how they pay for it. In the year 2024 to 25, the UK government will spend a total of £1,279 billion. And this will include everything from NHS spending to welfare payments to the Prime Minister's salary, and will pay for it primarily through taxes. This year, the UK government will collect around £1,141 billion in taxes, and this will all go towards this expenditure. But this will leave £137 billion worth of spending that isn't covered by taxes. So how does this get paid for? Well, as you might know, this leftover amount is known as the budget deficit and needs to be paid for by borrowing money, which the government does by issuing debt in the form of bonds. And this debt has built up over the years. There have only been 11 years since 1948 where we've not ran a budget deficit, which means that we've had to borrow a hell of a lot of money and not really had a chance to pay any of it back. As it stands, the UK's debt pile is around £2,800 billion. And like any other debt, we need to pay interest on this, which is currently costing the government around £105 billion each year, or around £3,700 per household. So as we can see, we've got a pretty significant debt burden in the UK, and most economists agree that we're now at a point where we really don't want to be increasing this anymore, which is why Rachel Reeves is so obsessed with trying to balance the budget, i.e. either increasing taxes or cutting spending to remove the need for new borrowing. Think each UK household is already paying £3,700 per year just on interest payments to service this debt, so we really don't want to be adding to this anymore. So let's keep this in our minds while we explore what Reform UK are promising to do if they get into power, and how this might affect our debt pile. Now, pinning down exactly what Reform are promising to do is often easier said than done, as Farage has a habit of changing what he says based on the political mood of the moment. But the most concrete thing we have to go on is Reform's 2024 manifesto, or contract as they like to call it, which sets out their promises if they were elected in the 2024 election. And probably their standout promise from a fiscal perspective are the huge tax cuts they're talking about, including lifting the personal allowance up to 20k, lifting the higher rate of tax threshold up to 70k, cutting corporation tax and other business taxes, and many, many more. The headline is that these cuts will cost around £90 billion, i.e. the government will collect £90 billion less in tax revenue each year. So the big question is, how will they pay for this? The money's got to come from somewhere, whether that be spending cuts or additional borrowing on top of our existing debt. Well, Reform are saying that they'll pay for this £90 billion solely through spending cuts, specifically in the following areas: abolishing all policies aimed at reaching net zero by the year 2050, end the use of hotels to house asylum seekers, scrapping all government diversity, equity and inclusion initiatives, slashing spending on arm's length government bodies or quangos, cutting government waste and inefficiencies, and scrapping interest payments by the Bank of England on reserves. So, job done I suppose. Farage says that these spending cuts will easily cover the £90 billion drop in tax revenue, so everything's paid for, right? Well, unfortunately, things just aren't that simple. And if we scratch beneath the surface, we start to see that the numbers just don't add up. So, let's go through the promised spending cuts and see how much we can save. Bear in mind the magic number we need to get to is £90 billion. Number 1, abolishing all net zero policies. Now, Farage and Reform claim that scrapping net zero spending would immediately save the country upwards of £30 billion per year. However, multiple independent analyses have concluded that this figure is untrue and misleading. According to the Office for Budget Responsibility, or OBR, the UK government spent just £7.7 billion on net zero investment in 2024 to 25. So, at most, scrapping net zero spending would only save £8 to £10 billion per year in the short term, far less than Farage's £30 billion plus. And this is before we factor in any of the short-term savings we get from net zero investment, such as a reduction in fossil fuel imports, all the longer-term benefits such as self-reliance on energy and a successful transition away from fossil fuels. But for the sake of argument, let's give Reform the benefit of the doubt and say that scrapping net zero policies will save £10 billion per year. Number 2, scrapping the use of hotels to house asylum seekers and refugees. Now, this one's pretty easy to put a number on. according to the National Audit Office, in 2023-24, the UK government spent £3 billion on housing asylum seekers and refugees in hotels. Now, just for the record, this would be very impractical to just scrap overnight without an alternative. But in theory, we could save £3 billion per year, bringing our total savings up to £13 billion per year. Number 3, scrapping all government diversity, equity and inclusion initiatives. Now, Farage claims that this could save around £7 billion per year. However, recent government reports indicate otherwise. For example, the Civil Service have just published that they spent £27 million on the initiatives in 2022-23. So where's the other £6.97 billion coming from? Well, the NHS spends money on DEI staff, as do local councils and other government bodies like HMRC. But if we add up all the estimates from all the sources, we struggle to get to a figure which is any more than around £100 million. But again, let's give reform the benefit of the doubt and double this estimate up to £200 million per year, which gives us a running total of savings of £13.2 billion. Number 4, slashing spending on quangos. Farage and Reform like to use the word quango, but what they're referring to are quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisations such as the Environment Agency or Ofsted. And Reform have promised a 5% cut to all quangos, which could theoretically save around £13 billion. And Farage argues that this wouldn't affect basic services, as quangos are full of waste and inefficiencies. And while this might be the case to some extent, it's worth pointing out that these organisations have already been squeezed over the years, particularly during the Cameron era austerity. So many economists are saying that you'd be lucky to get a few billion in savings from these organisations before basic services start to be cut. But again, let's give Reform the benefit of the doubt and say that they'll be able to get £10 billion worth of savings from this, bringing our running total up to £23.2 billion. Number 5, cutting government waste and inefficiencies. Now, in Farage's mind, this would essentially be the UK's version of DOGE, or the Department of Government Efficiency. But how effective this could actually be is very questionable. Farage is claiming that the government could save up to £50 billion per year just by streamlining things, without cutting any basic services. However, this sounds a lot like Elon Musk's promise to slash $2 trillion from US government spending. But as we've seen over the last few months, this has proven to be little more than a pipe dream, with the Financial Times estimating that the true impact of DOGE has been less than $10 billion. So if Trump and Musk can only achieve 0.5% of the savings they're promising, who's to say that Farage will fare any better? Well, as always, let's give Reform a huge chunk of leeway and say that they'll be able to deliver 10% of what they're promising, meaning that an extra £5 billion will be saved through cutting waste and inefficiencies, bringing our running total of savings up to £28.2 billion. And finally, number 6, scrapping interest payments by the Bank of England on reserves. Now, this point is by far the most complex, and we'd need a whole video to explain it fully, but essentially, Reform want to scrap the practice of the Bank of England paying out interest payments on reserves to commercial banks, which in theory could save the taxpayer around £30 billion per year. And in actual fact, many economists and central bankers would agree with this figure and say that it could be a sensible option to save the taxpayer money, including people like former Prime Minister Gordon Brown. However, you've also got a number of people on the other side of the fence, for example, the Bank of England chair Andrew Bailey, who say that it would undermine the country's fiscal policy and spook the markets, and that through a number of mechanisms, the savings made would just shift to costs elsewhere, so the net overall effect would be nil. And then you've got another camp of economists and central bankers which say that scrapping it altogether wouldn't work, but introducing a tiered payment system could save the taxpayer around £5 billion per year. So this point is genuinely subjective and isn't something that Farage has just pulled out of the sky. So to be fair to both sides, we'll assume that the middle position is correct, in that the practice could be tweaked to save the taxpayer £5 billion per year. And once again, to give Reform the benefit of the doubt, we'll double this up to £10 billion per year, just for good measure. So let's summarise what we've got. From the 6 sources we've discussed, Reform claimed that they could save over £100 billion, which would easily cover the £90 billion in tax cuts they're promising. However, as we've seen, this figure is super unrealistic, and a more accurate figure would be something along the lines of £38 billion worth of savings. And even this gives Reform a huge amount of leeway, so this would be the absolute upper bound that we could expect. So, Reform are promising £90 billion worth of tax cuts, but can only deliver at most £38 billion worth of savings. So they've got a £52 billion shortfall, which needs to come from somewhere. So what does this mean? Well, the way I see it, there are 3 possible scenarios if Reform were to come to power. Firstly, Reform fail to deliver on their tax cutting promises and only deliver much more moderate cuts. Secondly, Reform push through with their tax cuts and pay for it with massive and sweeping spending cuts across our already stretched basic services, such as the NHS. Or thirdly, they push through with their tax cuts and pay for it with huge amounts of new borrowing. Now, I don't know which of these 3 scenarios are the most likely, But I bet you there's a good chance that Farage chooses option 3, as he won't want to admit that he lied to the public, and he won't want to start slashing spending on things like the NHS and the state pension. So let's take a closer look at what might happen if Reform go for this option. Now, if Reform were to come into government and they chose to push through with their £90 billion worth of tax cuts, it's likely that they'll simply say that the 6 spending cuts we've discussed will easily pay for it. However, as we've seen, these cuts can at the absolute most save £38 billion, and this can't be done overnight, as a lot of these savings are coming from things like improving efficiencies, which could take years to flow through to actual savings. So, for the sake of argument, let's say that it's autumn 2029 and Reform UK have just won the general election, and in their first budget they declare that all of the £90 billion worth of tax cuts will come into force in April 2030, and they'll be paid for in their entirety by the 6 spending cuts we've discussed. So, what we've got here is a scenario where in the year April 2030 to April 2031, the government will collect £90 billion less in tax revenue, but will at most make £38 billion worth in savings. So it's guaranteed that they'll need to borrow at least £52 billion during this year to bridge this gap. And if they don't, then their day-to-day payments could be affected. Nurses might stop getting their salaries, for example. And for those eagle-eyed viewers out there, you might have noticed that this looks a lot like Liz Truss's mini-budget of September 2022, which promised £45 billion worth of unfunded tax cuts and caused absolute chaos in the markets and needed to be bailed out by the Bank of England. And while the mini-budget was pretty catastrophic for the UK economy, some estimates put the total economic fallout in excess of £100 billion, this Reform budget would be much, much worse. Firstly, because the mini-budget promised £45 billion worth of unfunded tax cuts, whereas this Reform budget is promising at least £52 billion, and this could be more like 60 or 70 billion if the savings aren't as good as they expect. And secondly, because this would be the second time in a decade that the UK government have put out one of these ridiculous and economically illiterate budgets, which would spook investors enormously, and confidence in UK bonds would plummet, meaning that our already enormous interest payments on our debt would skyrocket. So that £100 billion of economic fallout caused by the mini-budget could easily balloon into £200 or £300 billion if we were to see a Reform budget like I've described, which is something the country definitely can't afford. Okay, we've gone down a bit of a hypothetical rabbit hole there. It's by no means certain that Reform would put out a budget like this if they came into power. But what is certain is that if Reform want to push through with all of their tax cuts that they're promising, then a budget like this would be inevitable, as we've shown that their 6 main spending cuts won't get anywhere near to covering the £90 billion drop in tax revenue. But what do you think? Will Reform stick to their guns and implement these tax cuts, even if it means bankrupting the economy? Or is my reasoning just complete bollocks? Whatever you think, please let me know in the comments. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. And if you've enjoyed this video, please leave me a like and subscribe to the channel. It really does help me out. Thanks for watching.